A while back I was interested in trying out episodic stories online, like they used to do in newspapers. They would serialize stories in the newspapers. I decided to try it out first on existing stories, and public domain stories are a natural fit for that. So I went onto online, and you can find places where you can find public domain stories. And one of the stories I decided to try was The Lost World by Arthur Conan Doyle. You might recognize the name The Lost World because later I think the movie Jurassic Park was based on it. It's very interesting to see. If you watch the film and then read the story by Arthur Conan Doyle, you can see how the filmmakers were really inspired by the original story. You have the same types of people that you have in both stories, so that must have been inspiration. Back in those days, the stories were serialized in newspaper, and for the best writers, only the best writers had that privilege, and they would tell episodes of that story in the newspaper. They didn't even maintain chapters. They would just take a part of the story and print it for how much space they had in the newspaper. But what they did do was they created illustrations also, because if you read a newspaper, it works really well if there's an illustration there. Newspapers need it. So after they had serialized the story in newspaper form, they would make a book out of it, and that book naturally they already had these illustrations, so they might as well add these illustrations to the books. Also back then they were not good at reproducing photos, so what they did was they made illustrations. Before that they had these wood-cut illustrations. An artist would draw something and then craftsmen would cut them out in wood, so they printed out that way. The problem with that was that it's very a rigid way of creating lines, so that it created very rigid illustrations. And with photography suddenly what they could do is they could project a line drawing and etch it onto a copper plate and use that for offset print. So suddenly they could use the flourish of beautiful, quickly placed pen lines and use the illustrations from that in newspaper. They could print that. So suddenly you could have the actual original drawing of the artist printed in newspaper. They could not reproduce photography yet, but line art was possible, barely. The print technology was far from good back then. You would have thick lines would merge together and thin lines would fall away. So it must have been a nightmare for these artists back then who had to make these illustrations only to see that in print it just got destroyed basically. So I found the illustrations for The Lost World, and they were basically beautiful line drawings by Joseph Clement Coll. You might have heard of him. He has these beautiful loose lines. It's really impressive. If you have ever tried to draw in his style, you will find that you always fall short because you don't have his handwriting basically. It really is his drawing style. It's very hard to reproduce. And so the only illustrations I could find for the whole story were a scanned newspaper. And so next to the print quality being really bad, the scan resolution was, because they were scanning whole newspaper pages, the resolution was not very high. So the illustrations were not as good as they could be and as they probably used to be. So what I decided to do, I wanted to try out if I could re-ink them. So I took these scans. These are public domain. These are really old illustrations. And I put them in a layer and made them soft gray, and I started to re-ink them. And that experience blew my mind because I learned so much from that. First off, working digitally does feel like cheating because you can zoom out and work really precisely, and you can very easily zoom out. Zoom in and work very precisely, of course, and then zoom out, and then you have an overview of the entire illustration. You can erase. Of course, you have the undo button, and you can work on a separate layer to try out if something works. If it doesn't work, you throw the layer away. Otherwise, if you think it does work, you merge it into the layer below it. You can work with white. So it does feel like cheating, but it was still, I think, one of the things that I learned a lot from. One thing you have to realize is that these artists in those times, they were properly trained in academies to become fine art painters. So they were used to thinking in a painterly style. And you can see that in their illustrations. It's really done in the same style. You can see that it was designed by a painter. That's why in part probably the illustrations look so good. They probably just did it for the money. They probably wanted to paint, but these illustrations probably made them a lot of money. And what I learned from it, nowadays we often, when we draw with a pen, we will cross hatch to get at a tone, but he actually didn't do that. He would hatch in one direction and then keep on hatching until he had the right tone and the right texture, but he very carefully installed every line. He also did use cross hatching, but that's only when he wanted that type of texture. So it was by no means a given, and he would usually not use cross hatching, just hatching itself. And I found that if I wanted to achieve the same kind of effect, I had to also really look at the texture. Sometimes if you do the hatching, you see holes form, and these holes are part of a texture, and you have to keep on inking until you really get the right texture and the right tone. One thing that was deceptive was he also used to have these really loose lines in the background, and so I thought, well, I can do loose lines, but they're not just loose lines. He must have carefully designed these lines. He must have tried them out on a separate piece of paper, because if I did a loose line, it just didn't look as good as his, of course. I mean, he was really good. But so the trick is to make sure you design the loose lines before you place them in the drawing. And they look loose, but they're actually very carefully designed. Another thing you could do, and I've also done that with other artists, is to take their line art and print it out much bigger. Because they used to work bigger, right? What they did was they would shrink an illustration, because then mistakes fall away. So they actually worked on a much bigger sheet of paper. The drawings were much bigger, drawn on a much bigger scale. So do yourself a favor and give yourself the same opportunity. And print it out large. Go to a printing shop and have it printed. Do the line art in a very soft grey, or preferably even a blue, because you can later filter that out digitally. And then with traditional materials, ink and brush or pen, try to ink over it, and you will learn a lot by doing it. The thing is, if you're inking a modern artist, then you cannot distribute it without their permission, because that would be copyright infringement. And also, even if you're inking an older artist where his illustrations are in the public domain, like I did with these Joseph Clement Coll illustrations, you should still mention who created the original illustrations, because otherwise it's plagiarism. You have to still give credit to the original artist. But having said that, it is not about creating something that you distribute. It's about learning from that artist. So as an exercise, what you could try to do is look up your favorite ink artists and try to re-ink over them as an exercise to learn from them. Because if you can do that, you can crawl into their head and start to understand all the design decisions they made and all the thought process decisions they made. And you can learn a lot by actually sort of repeating the steps. And get to understand how they were thinking. And I learned a lot from doing that. I hope this was a useful tip for you, and that you would consider doing it sometime. For me, it was an exercise where I learned a lot. Okay, thank you for watching and listening.